Hi folks, it's Dr. Niyogi again. Today we are going to talk about our second unit, which is Sociological Paradigms. So in any intro-soc class, this is a very key component. You need to know the three major sociological paradigms. So you might be asking yourself, what is a paradigm? Sociologists use paradigms to understand the social world. So you might see that the word perspective or theory or approach is used interchangeably with the word paradigm. So essentially, they are like guiding principles or belief systems. It's a very broad viewpoint, it's a lens for looking at the world. And in many ways, again, think of it as a tool that we're using to describe society, understand society, and to build our hypotheses and theories. This connects again with sociological principles that we introduced in our first lecture on sociological imagination. When you think of it, all scientific disciplines have paradigms. This would include physics or biology. So think of it this way. If I am a biologist, I could be studying the human arm. And if I were a microbiologist versus a physiotherapist, I would still be studying the arm, but at two very different levels. Similarly, sociologists can study society at the micro level or at the macro level. So whenever you hear the word micro in sociology, we're talking about things like identity, interactions, and when you hear the word macro, we're talking about social institutions, etc. So the three major paradigms in sociology are structural functionalism, conflict paradigm, and symbolic interactionism. Structural functionalism is also known as functionalism for short. Sometimes it's also referred to as the order paradigm. And that's why sometimes you'll hear the order paradigm versus the conflict paradigm. Because functionalism and conflict are both macro level paradigms. Functionalists believe that society is like a giant organism with different parts, right? So the social institutions are the different body parts of this giant organism. And so, just like in an organism, these institutions are interconnected. Because they are interconnected, there's a relationship and interdependency between the different parts, right? And so as a result, when a change happens in any one part of that organism, the other parts will eventually be affected. And so in the image there, I give you examples of how institutions like family, education, religion, crime, etc., will have an impact on the social order, right? So that's why functionalism is also called the order paradigm, because it's interested in looking at how society maintains equilibrium, order, and doesn't break into chaos. So later on, when I introduce you to the major social theorists, you'll notice that one of the founding fathers of sociology, Durkheim, is seen as the father of structural functionalism. So in functionalism, each institution has manifest functions, which are the obvious functions of an institution, but also a set of latent functions. So when you think of the institution of education, for instance, the manifest content of schools is to teach you content, right? Whereas the latent function of schools is certainly socialization, right? So schools teach you how to behave, how to conform to social norms, hence maintaining equilibrium in society. Functionalists do make room for dysfunctions, right? So parts of the system that aren't quite working the way they're supposed to. But functionalists believe that when you have a dysfunction, for instance, poverty or crime, the system tends to correct itself and get back to a place of equilibrium. And this is the part that really differentiates it from the conflict paradigm. Conflict theorists imagine the society as different groups that are struggling over scarce resources. By the way, these different groups are unequal, so they don't have equal access to these scarce resources. Therefore, within the conflict paradigm, you have Marxist theory, where Marx was talking about workers versus the bourgeoisie or the capitalists. You have feminist theory, right, that looks at women as being unequal actors. You have critical race theory, which looks at Eurocentric perspectives versus people of color. And then, of course, you have queer theory as well, that looks at heteronormativity versus other perspectives, right? LGBTQ plus perspectives. So conflict paradigm has a very different take on society, a very different lens. If you take an example, if you look at wealthy people from the conflict perspective use their money and status to persuade the government into creating policies that will eventually be beneficial to them, right? And so people at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy are the ones that lose out. Finally, you have the micro perspective in sociology, which is symbolic interactionism. As the name suggests, these are folks who are interested in how we use symbols to make meaning through our interactions. So they are interested in the interpersonal. The example I have here in the image is of the looking glass theory, which we will definitely look at when we continue on to our mini topic of social construction of reality. In fact, symbolic interactionists are the ones who assert that all of reality is constructed through our interactions. We make meaning through our interactions, right? And so people construct their reality by interacting with one another, and therefore reality is never something that we can take for granted. It's never predetermined, okay? And it's a really fun topic, and I'm looking forward to sharing that with you in the next mini lecture. So if you were to do a comparison, you'd see that symbolic interactionists are coming from that micro perspective, structural functionalists and conflict paradigm are from that macro perspective, right? If you apply this to a particular social phenomenon, say for instance crime, you'll find that there are key differences in how each of these paradigms would approach crime. Structural functionalists would actually see crime as having functions in society. And you might be a little surprised by that, but think about it. If we had no crime, several people would be out of jobs, right? So there wouldn't be any cops, there wouldn't be any lawyers, the entire justice system would have no purpose, and social workers would be out of jobs, so a lot of people, right? Prison guards would be out of jobs. So structural functionalists would point out that crime provides jobs. But at another level, when you think of it, when we see people committing crime, structural functionalists would argue that there are consequences to crime. In other words, crime doesn't pay. When the rest of us in society observe what happens to criminals, is something negative. Either it's a fine or prison time. The rest of us look at that and we're like, we don't want those negative consequences. And it makes us conform to the norms, follow the rules, right? And so structural functionalists think of crime as functional, as maintaining social norms. And of course, if crime rates go up to a level where they become a dysfunction in society, structural functionalists believe that the system will correct itself. Conflict paradigm would have a very different take on crime. They would point out that crime is largely committed by socioeconomically marginalized individuals because they have no mainstream routes to resources open to them. They would further point out that there are very different consequences for street crime versus white-collar crime. There are different sentencing rules for crack versus cocaine. So they will point out that folks who are wealthy and powerful in society determine what is criminal behavior, and there are very different consequences depending on your social location. Finally, symbolic interactionists might take on topics like the criminal identity, labeling theory, how do labels work, what happens when you are labeled deviant or criminal, how criminal behavior is learned behavior through socialization, through interactions, right? So they would take on the micro perspective on crime, okay? So hopefully that example illustrates how the different paradigms have different approaches. You can do that exercise with any social issues such as poverty or technology. In fact, that's what I urge you to do final part of this mini lecture, which is choose any social institution or process and then think about how the three paradigms apply to that. Okay, I want you to connect this analysis with the analysis you had done in our previous unit, right? And ultimately, you will submit to the discussion post how you've applied the concepts of sociological imagination and one of the three paradigms and how that applies to your self-reflection when you think about yourself, right? So that's all I have for this particular mini unit. I will see you for social construction next. And trust me, that's going to be a lot of fun. All right, see you folks.